Good evening, everyone. My name is Malcolm Mahoney, and I'm the debate director for the Dartmouth Political Union. The DPU is the preeminent nonpartisan student-led political organization on Dartmouth College. We promote open discourse by hosting speakers from across the political spectrum, holding student debates, and organizing campus-wide political discussions on relevant topics. This event is part of the DPU's Democracy Summit, which is a series of lectures and debates on the endurance of democracy domestically and internationally, from this past winter through the fall of 2023. Thank you to the Political Economy Project, the Dickey Center, and the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy for allowing the Dartmouth Political Union to join them in co-sponsoring this event.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Russ Muirhead. I teach in the government department. Welcome. Don't be afraid to come down. Come down. Sit on the steps. There's some chairs in the middle. It will not interrupt us at all if you have to get up and move around a little bit. I would like to welcome my friend Tori Holt, director of the Dickey Center, where we are, and thank the Dickey Center for hosting us tonight. And most of all, welcome my old buddy Pratap Mehta, who's a professor at Princeton right now. He, like most people, for Pratap, Princeton is his second choice. His first choice was, well, not Dartmouth, but Ashoka University, which he actually participated in, helped to initiate about a decade ago, and then for which he served as the vice chancellor, which is roughly the equivalent of what we call the president of the university. And when you and I bumped into each other about 5 years ago, you were explaining to me that you were stepping down from being vice chancellor because you didn't want to attract. Pratap writes for the Indian Express, other outlets, journalistic outlets in India. He's a critic of the regime, of the Modi regime. He's a defender of pluralistic India rather than an India that is really ruled in the name of the Hindu religious majority. And he didn't want to attract the government's ire to this new and fragile university. So he said, I'm stepping away from administration so they don't confuse me with the institution. To protect the institution, I'm just going to be a professor. And besides that, I prefer just being a teacher to being an administrator. So he went back to the kind of back benches of the faculty where, you're just teaching small groups of students, books from the history of political thought. And you'd think from a position like that, little old Pratap wouldn't threaten anybody. But even that was too potent for the Modi regime, and so he was pressured again to sort of protect the university by leaving it, and having left Ashoka, Princeton said finally we get Pratap Mehta among our faculty. Come here, and that's where he is at least half the year now. So because Pratap's in the U.S., we were able to get him up here to Hanover. And join us for a conversation about democracy in India and democracy. And so to just start us out, Pratap, first let me the first sentence of, I think, your most recent column in the Indian Express: India's political system is veering toward a full-blown tyranny. How did India get there? Can you just set the scene for those of us who, though we're very interested in Indian politics, only see it out of the corner of our eye, being so far away?
First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you particularly, Tori, for sparing your time. The answer to your question would take a few hours, so I'm not going to succumb to that temptation, if there is an answer. I mean, because I actually think in all humility, one should begin by saying that almost all the things we used to assume about Indian politics and the conceptual frameworks we used to bring to bear on thinking about that politics, actually, we are increasingly unsure of. I think there's a lot of pretense in my discipline, political science, in our forms of public writing. We have to pretend that we understand actually what's going on. And frankly, most of the time these days, I think the proper response is a certain kind of bewilderment. I think we can say 3 or 4 things, I think, just to kind of kick off the discussion, just to sort of, as points of conversation. Would love to hear from all of you what you think about this. One, as a descriptive matter, I think the following propositions are true, that Prime Minister Modi is immensely popular, and so far he has acquired legitimacy and popularity through proper electoral means. I think as of now, at least, we can quibble at the margins. India's elections are as free and fair as can be, and probably as free and fair have been. So this is a genuinely popular regime, right? I think the second proposition I think we can say is, and that what makes this moment politically very paradoxical, that unlike many other right of center rulers, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Mr. Modi is less incompetent a manager of the economy. I don't think the Indian economy will do as spectacularly as the government claims it is doing. On the other hand, I don't think it is also going to face the kind of protracted crisis that many people on the left and center think or hope sometimes politically that it is going to do. I think he has a particular development model in mind, and there is a sense in which I think many Indians do see experience a kind of expansion of Indian state capacity. Now, we could argue that that expansion of state capacity would have happened regardless. But I think in all fairness, analytically, one has to say, you're not going to get a kind of precipitate economic crisis that will somehow create a broad-based momentum against the regime. Having said that, I think on the flip side, 2 other propositions are also true, which is this regime is deeply authoritarian in almost every sense of the word and by every measure of authoritarianism. It seeks to control the information order in the broadest sense of the term, particularly mass media, television media, regulation of social media even, and has been actually quite spectacularly successful at it, particularly if you go outside of the kind of tiny confines of the English press, right? The checks and balances that we assumed existed in the Indian institutional structure. The Indian Supreme Court, for example, was considered one of the most powerful independent courts in the world, particularly after the 1970s. Those institutions have more or less collapsed. I co-edited a massive Oxford handbook to the Indian Constitution, which we thought would be this kind of reference work, that would define debates for a long time to come. I now have to enter a class on Indian constitutional law and say I don't know I can't say with a straight face I know what the Indian Constitution is anymore. And I think this is a kind of signal lesson, I think, on how fragile, right, institutions are. So control of the information order, erosion of checks and balances, increasing use of state power to target, in a very, very partisan way, large numbers of opposition leaders. Somebody has compiled the statistics. If you look at the Enforcement Directorate's cases that it's pursuing, it's 90 cases against different opposition leaders, and they all seem to come up conveniently at particular points. So on all of those measures, right, that make for a robust liberal democracy outside of the sphere of electioneering, not to mention individual targeting of journalists. We have colleagues, I can just name one of India's most important Dalit intellectuals, Anand Teltumbe, who's in prison as we speak. So that stuff is in a sense for real. It's authoritarian and it's also deeply majoritarian, right? Its single-minded aim is to, in a sense, consolidate India's identity as a Hindu nation, and everything else, in a sense, follows from it. In fact, I think its economic governance model, actually its pragmatism on that, is also in service of that ideological model. It's not an either-or in some senses. I think it's a smart enough regime that realizes that the way you consolidate, in part, your ideological agenda is by building welfare coalitions, deft management of the economy in some ways. And let me just kind of finish by saying that I think India is in uncharted territory in two ways. Communalism, as it's called in India, or majoritarianism, has been an undercurrent in Indian politics for a very long time. And if you take the longer history of the Indian subcontinent, I think it's a moment in a very long conversation that begins 1857. What is, in a sense, the distribution of power between different communities in South Asia? And I think this is just one more episode in that. India's also had periods of authoritarianism, 1975 to 1977. But we've never had a period where the two have been combined so effectively as they are now. And most worryingly, where the checks and balances that we always thought existed in Indian society. So there used to be a thesis in political science that Indian politics will broadly remain centrist, not because any of the constituent forces of Indian society are centrist, but because the balance of social power, right? Whether it's along region, whether it's along caste, whether it's along class, those cleavages will make it difficult for any majoritarian consolidation to take place. And I think Mr. Modi has, in a sense, given a lie to that assumption. And we can talk about why. I think it says something about deeper social transformations in India. So there are no cross-cutting social cleavages left. The opposition parties, the Congress party is very weak, but the other regional parties have, for the most part, made their peace with Hindu nationalism. They want to compete with the government on local issues, state elections. But to me, what's stunning is actually the emerging political consensus around Hindu nationalism as India's ideological project going ahead. What forms it'll take, we can in some senses discuss. So that's what makes this unprecedented. The second thing which worries me personally on the democracy question, is in India we've always taken peaceful transitions of power for granted, for the most part, and India has done actually spectacularly well. What has changed, I think, in the last 5 to 7 years is 3 things are being put in place that make me worried about whether a peaceful transition of power will be possible in the way that we have seen in the past. So first of all, when a regime targets its opponents to the extent this regime has, just by virtue of its self-interest, it begins to fear the prospect of losing power, right? I cannot imagine Mr. Amit Shah, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Chief Minister of UP, Yogi Adityanath, very calmly contemplating the possibility that they will just melt away into the opposition at some point if it looks like they're losing an election. Second, there is an institutionalization of a regime of violence in the structures of the state and civil society, very closely tied to the ruling party. And that infrastructure is not going to melt away that easily. I think, and its institutionalization is actually quite significant in some ways. And I think, so even if for some reason there was some kind of political backlash, it's hard to see that in some senses kind of melt away. And I think the third reason is, I kind of began by saying, look, this conversation is one moment in a kind of longer history of thinking about identities in South Asia. And that conversation provides lots of different opportunities for mobilization. You can see what's happening in the region, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that one should not safely assume that even if there were going to be political backlash or resistance to the regime, you will get a smooth transition of power. And that's what worries me, very frankly.
Yeah.
So I hope I've not gone on too long, but
well, no. I mean, the specter of violence is chilling. Is India the third largest Muslim country in the world?
Well,
could it be redescribed?
Second
largest.
Yeah, I mean that used to be the right.
Yeah. And so this country you could describe as the second largest Muslim country in the world is consolidating itself around an ethno-nationalistic identity. An intolerant identity. So there's no genuine, it sounds like there's no genuine constituency for pluralism, for liberal pluralism.
But why is that in such a diverse country? And if I can just pull out something you said in Foreign Affairs a few years ago, you were writing about Kashmir.
Right.
And you said it is the collapse of empathy that allows a democracy to endorse mass arrests, human rights violations, pellet guns, barbed wire, and the suspension of liberties and rights. And so if a population may not see themselves and the others to watch that violence and tolerate it seems to be what you're driving at.
So it's a very big question. And I think one can come at it two different ways. One is, I think, what you just alluded to, right? Which is, and I had kind of made this argument partly as a kind of provocation that, in a way, what we saw happen in Kashmir over the last 15, 20 years, that actually was a kind of, that should be a warning sign to the rest of India. That this regime thought that what it was going to do was kind of integrate Kashmir more fully into India. Actually, what it was going to produce is more of a political culture that reflected the Indian state's relationship with Kashmir in the rest of India, right? Which is strong armed tactics, institutionalization of violence, suppression of civil liberties, freedom of expression in some ways. And we seem to be very slowly, at least, inching towards that future. And the very slowly part is important because I think there is still that, people use that slightly ugly metaphor of kind of the frog in the boiling water, where I think the more charitable interpretation of what's going on right now is to say that, look, most people do not think that they will experience this kind of violence themselves. Second, I think this regime has been extraordinarily sophisticated in the way in which it has managed this agenda. Unlike the emergency, we don't have mass arrests in the sense of hundreds of opposition leaders being rounded up and put in prison. The regime so far has been conscious that the political cost of an episode of very large-scale violence, right, from the scale of, let's say, the Gujarat riots of 2002, that might unleash a dynamic that could, in some senses, rebound against it. And so the mechanism, in a sense, of sending signals is much more controlled but equally effective. An odd lynching there, an odd arrest here. But everybody who understands Indian society and Indian political system understands that what this signal is. It also keeps the international community actually very happy in some ways that, you might say statistically, the regime could argue, look, how is India worse off than it was 10, 15 years ago? The number of communal riots has certainly increased. Even the government's own data is showing that. Although the government's own data also shows that statistically the number of deaths hasn't increased dramatically. I mean, I know this is a kind of macabre way of thinking about this, but there is a kind of statistical management of this process, right? And so a lot of people are in this position of saying, well, this could be a risk down the line, but right now these risks are not a deal breaker for us. So that's the more charitable interpretation, right? That, yes, abstractly we understand there are these risks. On principle, we disagree with the direction. But given the alternatives, all things considered, we don't think this form of governance as we are seeing now is a deal breaker for us. And I think that's one way of, I think, as I said, the most charitable gloss on what's going on.
What are the institutions of violence, the institutionalization of violence that you referred to, as opposed to, say, vigilantism?
So there's a bunch of institutions. So one is actually state-sanctioned vigilantism. So one of the things, for example, BJP state governments make a lot of is the summary bulldozing of the houses of people they think are miscreants. They think, without evidence sometimes, without due process at least, that they've committed a crime or they've started a riot. It's a way of signaling a kind of tough law and order stance, right? The second is, look, state agencies in India have always been prone to partisan use. I think the BJP is right that this is not, something they are inventing in some ways. But the scale of it and the systematicity of it, right, is, I think, in some senses of a very different order. Like Viktor Orban's Hungary, that's, I think, a good model. There is this phenomenon of the rule by law, where you can use the administrative processes of the state, right? Tax authorities, right? Just ask any media house what their relationship with government is, right? Tax authorities. You can weaponize administrative processes, right? In ways that suppress dissent. The third level is, in some senses, the association with a number of civil society organizations who can, if need be, orchestrate the right kind of violence in the right doses with some degree of plausible deniability of the state. We've just seen an example, actually, just a few days ago, that these Ram Navami is this big festival where Hindus take out processions. And for the first time, second year in a row, after a long period, actually, of declining communal violence, in a number of cities in India, right, those processions have been used to instigate or provoke violence, including for the first time in Bihar after a long, right? So you create a kind of civil society infrastructure of that kind, right, which can produce that demonstrable violence. And I think the interesting question is, when is it going to be deployed and on what scale? So there's a whole complicated technology of governance here.
If I could pull out and say, if Kashmir is an example of sort of early warning signs of what might be the measures that Modi and the government use, we in the international community have been looking at the decay of democracy. Right. And sometimes the most wobbly point is between full democracy and full authoritarianism. And I think that's what you're pointing to here. Is there anything that outside countries and peoples can do to try and prevent what you're suggesting, which is the next stage of expanded violence?
So the short answer is no, and you probably shouldn't even try. And I know I'm saying this to somebody, kind of with all you, which is in three respects, right? One, look, honestly, the worst thing that happens to liberal democracy around the world is if it becomes an objective of U.S. foreign policy.
Stay off the agenda.
I mean, in some senses, the last thing you want to do is make democracy a instrument of geostrategy, and that inevitably happens whenever the U.S. gets involved. I mean, that's the nature of this beast, right? So it actually does democracy a lot of harm. The second thing, I have to say the Modi regime has worked this out perfectly, that the US has simply no power and appetite to do this. In fact, I think the international context explains part of the cover that the regime actually has at the moment. When I think Mr. Modi first came to power, there was still a kind of culture in global politics where if you wanted to be members of certain clubs, you had to be socialized in a certain kind of way. Mr. Trump broke that nexus very clearly, but actually the after effects still in some senses continue. And the Biden administration, perhaps wisely recognizing the limitations of its power, will not only not act, it is in no position to act. And the Indian government knows it very well and has played that absolutely wonderfully. You have to actually say that they've kind of timed. There is a timing to all of this that actually matters, right? The third reason, which is in some senses most practical, is that country like India's size, in a way, this has to be India's own struggle, and it, I find it hard to believe that a country of India's complexity will not at some point find the resources to, in some senses, resist. But one of the catalysts, right, that this regime thrives on is exactly this idea that the West or foreign powers are out to get us. I mean, what's remarkable to me, thinking of ideological formations, is that even this regime, in a context like India, right, has decided to pick on alleged interference by Mr. Soros in India's democracy as a theme to be nightly broadcast on primetime news three days in a row. I mean, that tells you something, right, in some ways. So I think having a clear-eyed conversation about the nature of these democratic challenges, and finally, I have to say, I mean, there's also a moment in world politics where the credibility and authority of US democracy is at its lowest it has been for years and years. Both in terms of internal violence, the possibility of polarization, that the idea that somebody could speak on Indian democracy from the point of view of external authority, that simply doesn't wash anymore. Unfortunately, that's the world we are in. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a conversation Indian citizens will have to have. As academics, as a community of people who belong to the Republic of Letters, we obviously have to analyze this, think of its deeper causes, catalog it as dispassionately as we can. But that's probably the best service we can do.
And speaking of cataloging it, when you and I were starting out as teachers, there was a kind of wave of democratization crashing around the world, the third wave, and now a couple decades later, it's not just India where people pick out what they call democratic backsliding, but you've been mentioning Hungary, some Poland, some would mention Brazil, the United States. And the phenomenon seems to have similarities as we look around. So when you do analyze it, Pratap, do you see this as specific to India, or do you see this as a reflection of forces that are affecting democracy around the world?
So I think the boring answer is that it is both, which is there is clearly a global trend, and it is actually remarkable in the history of democracy how those trends, these trends appear simultaneously. I mean, we were actually discussing in class a few months ago, Sam Huntington writes this Crisis of Democracy report. You might remember early 70s. And, liberal democracy in crisis, right? Just a few years later, he's writing about the third wave of democratization, right? You can actually chart those three waves through three actually points in his career: political order in changing societies, third wave. You forget those enormously amazing volumes that Stepan and Linz edited in the late 70s, The Crisis of Liberal Democracy. They're actually quite bracing reading. And they, by the way, had chapters on Europe and North America, right? So at one level, the rise and fall in some senses of democracies, there seems to be, there are global patterns here, not just in terms of the way in which ideologies borrow from each other, but are there common structural conditions? And I think on that, I think it's worth thinking about two things, right? Which is, first of all, a lot of the trends towards democratic backsliding were exacerbated by the 2009 global financial crisis. I think we underestimate the political effects of that crisis, right? What did that crisis do politically? One, it at one stroke delegitimized whatever structures of elite power were governing democracies across the world, right? Right? That was the social contract with those elites. And I speak of elites broadly, right? Think of it as a kind of old regime. Dartmouth is part of that old regime of institutions of higher education, our regulators, our elite press corps, right? And across the world, one of the interesting things about this moment is that anti-elitism is a common thread in every democracy, right? And this elite broadly understood. So the attack on universities, not unknown to this country. The attack on elite forms of media, not unknown to this country, right? So the 2009 financial crisis does not appear revolutionary, but it does have this revolutionary impulse of saying, look, there is something called the old regime that governed us, and any new political dispensation to gain legitimacy has to, in some senses, tear it down. And one of the political challenges for us, right, is that our response to that is a kind of restoration of that old regime. I mean, it's trying to kind of argue for the Bourbon monarchy. Let's just tinker around with processes in Congress. If we could just, tinker at the margins with things like filibuster, the forms of the Supreme Court, all will be well. Actually, post-2009 politics has changed fundamentally, right? So I think that's one thing that's common, that in a sense, it's that vacuum that then allowed a whole range of kind of populist forces, nationalist forces to bubble up, right? The second thing I think it did, which is, I think, short-term success notwithstanding, I think the world is still struggling to figure out what our models of development are going to be going ahead. From 1989 onwards, 1991, India's liberalization starts, right? From 1989 to roughly 2009, there is a broad direction in which most of the world was moving together, right? Integration into the global economic system is a good thing, on balance, right? So we create all these wonderful kind of international economic institutions from the WTO onwards. And there's a global consensus. Different countries manage it differently, but integration into the global economy is a good thing. Broadly, what we call liberalization is a good thing. Domestic liberalization in countries like India. Post-2009, that consensus has been broken. So every country is now, right, in a more autarkic mode of economic engagement, right? What was the appeal of Mr. Trump? And in a sense, I think Modi, I think there's a parallel to here, which was to say that, look, we are going to show that there are politicians in charge. The economy is something that is going to be subject to collective will formation, not be left to these anonymous forces of globalization, right? And the successful politicians have in part been ones that have responded to that, whether on the left or the right. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to take a rightward turn. So in that sense, I do think the 2009 financial crisis sets a kind of global scene, which creates the space for some combination of populism and nationalism to emerge.
So the defenders of democracy with liberalism, with rule of law, with pluralism, what I'm hearing you say is that they have to learn how to be anti-elitist also. They can't just be defenders of the ancien regime.
I think they have to learn to be self-critical, right? In two or three respects. One, to actually recognize that they had indeed become a closed elite, right? One of the things, right? I mean, if you think of one thing I think a lot about is the politics of universities professionally, and I've tried to study the politics of universities. This assumption that universities are no longer the site of social mobility and channels of empowering large numbers of ordinary citizens, that they have in some senses become more exclusive clubs. Whether that's empirically true or not, we can actually argue, but this sense is actually very powerful in, I think, a lot of democratic societies. The second, I think, change, at least in the way people talk about elites. So one of the things about elites is, right, elites can often provide a intra-elite check and balance. Universities traditionally were not supposed to be part of the ruling establishment, right? They are independent checks on political power. They are independent checks on regulators. They are independent checks on public discourse. But the sense over the last few years, and returning to America after all these years, it's actually quite striking. Maybe this is just, again, empirically not true, but the way people actually talk about, in some sense, elites, that instead of those intra-elite checks and balances working, right, we are, in a sense, all tagged as elite institutions with exactly those pathologies, right? That afflict American society in some ways, right? So the nexus between universities and finance, for example, right?
Right.
So it does actually come across as an integrated regime rather than elites. And the third thing for liberals, which is, I think, the hardest, which is we also have to think about the ways in which we instrumentalized the rule of law to our progressive purposes. I mean, one of the hardest thing about institutions, right, is institutions, by their very character, they are forms of authority. And what that means is often they will not come out with outcomes that you might prefer, right? I mean, that's the nature of processes, right? Rule of law, that's the nature of democratic processes. But I think there is a strong strain in progressive politics that actually was quite willing to instrumentalize the rule of law in its own ways, right? We worry about Mr. Trump or Mr. Modi instrumentalizing the rule of law. But think of the ways in which, right, under pressure of war, under the garb of national security, right? All those ways in which we liberals created the space for saying, actually the law is just an instrument for immediate political purposes, right? And I think that instrumentalization of authority, you're seeing in the US with courts, right? The authority of the courts has to be now measured by the instrumental ends they achieve immediately, right? That's a pathology that cuts across left and right. I mean, I'm constantly amazed by how many of our well-meaning colleagues in the liberal center, on the left, right? Their view on processes depends on whether they are on the winning side or on the losing side. And in the long run, that has actually created that culture where you say, look, politics is just now a Schmittian game of who wins, who loses. All forms of institutional authority are to be weaponized for particular partisan ends. And that's going to be a harder state for us to recover from. That charge hurts liberals more, right? Because all the other side has to show, as Cloud always used to say, is liberals are hypocrites.
Right.
And your authority collapses because you're claiming to occupy a ground, right, on freedom of expression, right? I mean, very frankly, I think I can say this in the Indian context. The left and the center, was always ambivalent about free expression, right? It's enshrined in Indian law, but ostensibly for progressive purposes. So that's a kind of deeper crisis of institutions that, again, you see emerge globally together.
Let me just invite students to ask questions. They're already ready. Let me start with you.
Hold on, I think the microphone. You did.
Oh, we do have a microphone coming to you right down here in the front.
Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your ideas and views with us. So probably my question has some subparts, so I will stick with 3 parts of that. So, and that will be about, so I took a course in comparative politics, which was about the authoritarian regimes and how authoritarian regimes in some countries declined, on the other hand, how they increased. So now, the rise of authoritarian regimes, if specified to India. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we went from a bipolar to a unipolar, where US became the only superpower in the world, and that that created an incentive for the countries to somehow align themselves with the West, who were the allies of the US, and they were the defenders and promoters of liberal democracy. And that had probably a factor that some countries, let's say in Eastern Europe and also in other countries like Mexico, Taiwan, they also became democracy. So now, how has that changed with the rise of China and Russia, that now they are somehow undermining the authority of the US in the global system, and how that has also impacted that India is also becoming a major country now, I assume the 5th largest country based on GDP, and also that's India is also not taking US seriously. So how has the rise of Russia and China affected this promotion or survival of democracy? And secondly, there is a theory or a notion that when the middle class is increasing in a country, so they become somehow a big player in a country, and that the increase of middle class is also a step towards democratization and building of institutions. At the same time, how can state capacity, whether is a catalyst towards democratization or the opposite? For example, countries like Turkey and Hungary, they were democracies before 2009 or 2010, and they had relatively big state capacities with sophisticated institutions.
Yeah,
so how has that been in India? Thank you.
And you don't have 3 hours. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So 2 quick thoughts. So look, at one level you can say, look, as the balance of power in the global system is shifting and the world is becoming less unipolar, obviously it gives different regimes opportunities to play the global game in a different way. And many authoritarian regimes have benefited. But I actually don't think that's the big story here, because frankly, that has always been around. It was always the issue in the Cold War. It's also been the case. You will always be surprised by which of the superpowers subverts democracy, which of the superpowers supports democracy. That's always also had a kind of complicated history. The way I see it is, I think the real issue, and this is something, going back to your question, Russ, about the global context, is I think it's worth thinking about the fact that it's not just liberal democracy that's in crisis, right? There were 3 or 4 important global political projects that were at play in the post-1989 world, right? There's liberal democracy is obviously one, right? And it's different varieties and forms. And you're right, in Eastern Europe, it didn't get institutionalized because in part, at least as Stephen Holmes argues, it was seen as a kind of Western export, right? But there was the Chinese project of the party state as a political form, right? There's this enormously consequential project that runs kind of in different forms, a question that runs from kind of Pakistan to Egypt to Nigeria, which is what's the form a modern Islamic state, constitutional state might take. And one of the interesting things about this moment is actually all of those projects are in crisis. Remember, China has also had to go through a greater degree of closure and internal control than was the case 10, 15 years ago, right? You can see West Asia in some senses is kind of struggling, right? Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. I mean, the fate of that project in all of its different iterations. I mean, I'm crudely simplifying. So I would not say that, there's something unique that somehow the rise of China has shown that kind of, liberal democracies in crisis, there's this alternative model. Certainly it's attractive to a lot of leaders, right? And certainly China's not just economic development, but the party structure as a political form is very, very attractive to the BJP. I mean, there is a kind of China envy, not on, I think, China's economic growth, but actually the political form, how a party system, single party, can actually create a form of governance where almost all the conflicts of society are mediated within a party, right? But I think it is worth saying, it's actually not clear that those projects are not experiencing an internal crisis of their own. I think Xi Jinping is a symptom of that crisis, right? This is not, now you can argue about the continuity and change in the Chinese regime, but when a regime has to resort to more closure and coercion, it's usually a sign that it's facing an internal legitimation crisis as well, right? And so maybe one can broaden out the question, right? It's not the crisis of liberal democracy. It is different forms of legitimation that had acquired a stable form post-1989, all of them struggling in their own different ways, and which is what makes this a dangerous moment for the world, because when there is a domestic legitimation crisis, right? Your behavior in the international system and the consequences for the international system are usually more negative, right? The temptation to resort to nationalism, that's the last source of legitimation for any regime, right? Okay. So I think that's the way in which that dynamics might actually play out, rather than will countries play off the US and China against each other.
Let's collect a couple questions.
Yeah.
In the lavender sweater down here, halfway, in the very center, the part that's most difficult to get a microphone to.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Mehta. I work on literary cultures of the Indian national emergency in the mid-1970s, and I think a lot about how the resonance of the emergency, how the emergency resonates today. And of course, today's regime is also being called an undeclared emergency. And so I just wanted to hear you speak a little bit about these two events in the mid-1970s and what's happening in India today. We just saw the Indian Express, the article around censorship, and it's really resonant of the newspaper's response to the emergency. Do you think that there are parallels, and or do you think that the 1970s emergency prepared the ground for what's going on in India today in some way or the other? Thank you so much.
I think you had a couple
Yeah,
of
we
hands.
could go, yeah.
And maybe one more from the back row, and then we'll turn it over to Pratap.
Do.
Two more? Okay, two more. Thank you, Tori.
I'll give a short
You're better than
Professor, you spoke earlier about an institutional degradation in India, and you mentioned the Supreme Court. You still see, empirically, a lot of Supreme Court judgments that are clearly against, the government's viewpoint. So in that respect, wouldn't you say that this is sort of a function of our system of checks and balances playing out, and the actual apocalyptic scenario that you're painting isn't quite there yet? And like, if you're not saying that, then, would you say that, our current Chief Justice, whose father was also Chief Justice, right? Like, is he less impartial than 1978?
Okay, we will get one more Tori's suggestion over here. Thank you. Yeah. It's coming from your other side, yeah, from your right.
Hi, thank you so much. I know that there's long been a lot of concern around the potential outbreak of large-scale mass violence in India, and I was really interested to hear you say that the government very carefully kind of manages those statistics and tries not to reach a certain threshold. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that and talk about under what conditions you think we might actually see kind of them crossing that threshold, or whether that's not likely in the near term. Thank you.
So I'll take them in reverse order. I think it's a difficult question to answer, right? So one, because it kind of, the terms of discourse that I've been using kind of presume a kind of control model. And my worry is that whenever we have seen ethno-nationalism being deeply institutionalized, it almost never ends well, right? I mean, it's a question of, and to me, the parallel is actually, on that issue is actually more, I shouldn't say it in the presence of kind of, wonderful historians of South Asia present here, like Doug Haynes and stuff, but the parallel is more like the late 1930s and 1940s, where prospectively it did not look that bad. I mean, these looked like fringe elements, but you actually saw that under the surface, right, undercurrents were being unleashed, right, which end up in 1947, right? And there is that kind of sense there, which is, in my lifetime, I've never seen the kind of open legitimization of hate and violence of this degree and this extent. Not even at the height of the Ayodhya movement in the 1990s, actually, right? So one is this almost, you might sense of foreboding, that if you look at any historical episode anywhere in the world where this kind of prejudice is openly institutionalized, at least in the elite circles and those who manage the state, it almost never, I think, ends well. You may actually not get a outbreak of mass violence. I mean, it depends. My worry is actually that its likelihood is greatest when the regime feels that it might actually lose power for some other reason. Actually, that's so, and that's what makes this a kind of catch-22 situation in some, right? Heads we win, tails you lose, right? In some ways, but the controlled escalation of conditions because one of the functions of violence is to polarize identities, right? Because it forces people into a kind of either or situation. The fact that it is using that violence, as we just saw in Bihar recently, to actually create and polarize those identities, I think that should be a warning sign that this may not be easily contained. The Supreme Court question, I hope the current Chief Justice turns out to act more independently. He's certainly showing a little bit more sign than his predecessors were. But here's my prediction in the Supreme Court. I'll stick my neck out on this one. It will do enough to keep us political theorists, India's lawyer class, invested in the process, right? Give you small victories. But on things that fundamentally matter to the Hindutva identity of the regime or its institutional hold over political power, it is actually not going to challenge the executive. And I think there's too much premature, and you can see this pattern already, actually. I mean, a lot of the most important cases, including electoral bonds, freedom, you can list those cases. They could already have been heard and settled. Most of the orders it's passing are after the effect, right? yesterday, I mean, just to take one example, right? So people are celebrating this judgment where it said, look, the government cannot withhold the license to a media group simply on national security grounds. Seems like a small procedural victory, right? But it was the same day that the petition saying, is there political partisanship in the use of ED and CBI, right? Which, again, admittedly is a gray area for the court to get into. But the swiftness with which it was disposed of. And I actually am a complete believer with learned hands, sort of, wise advice. Any democracy that looks to the courts to save the democracy has already lost the plot. That's elite, upper middle class, wishful thinking. So I'm not even in that sense that concerned about where the kind of courts. I mean, it could at most give you some respite. It could give you some cover. But judges do not save democracies. There's no record of any jurisdiction in the world where, in a deep fundamental sense, that's true.
And one more, the first question.
Yeah, the first question.
Yeah, no.
You're hoping that we can.
No, I was trying to think of a short. So, like with every analogy, there are kind of disanalogies built into it. So, look, at one level, 1975 has a causal relationship to this moment, which is it's the moment of the emergency that allows the RSS and the Jansangh to become legitimate political forces again, right? I mean, that is, in a sense, the turning point. I mean, so that's one kind of direct sense in which there is a kind of causal correlation. I do think, however, the circumstances are different. I think in the 70s, the nature of the economic crisis was very different. And we actually forget that backdrop to the emergency in some ways, right? There was widespread anti-government mobilization. I mean, the paradox of this moment is actually there isn't any. Farmers' protests notwithstanding, I mean, I have a kind of view on the limitations of that, right? So, in a way, the international context was very different, right? I mean, I think, I don't like the foreign hand arguments, but Allende was toppled in 73, right? Every leader outside of the West saw that as a kind of pivotal moment about, and so Indira Gandhi could stand up in parliament and say, I need to throw CIA agents out, right? The nature of the opposition was very different, right? You actually had, in some sense, and so to me, the two critical differences, which I think are going to matter for this moment, is one is, we always used to assume in Indian politics, as I said, that there are these social cleavages, region and caste, that will at some point assert themselves against the consolidation of a Hindu majoritarian identity. I think there is something happening to those identities as well. And some of those developments are good. So, for example, I think there is actually a greater fragmentation of caste identity. There is a greater individualization of Indian politics, which actually allows, paradoxically, the mobilization of new identities by Hindu nationalism, right? There's one lesson the right has understood in India, which the left and center hasn't. Our politics has always been socially deterministic. Let's just get the right caste and class groups in coalition, and we'll sail through. The right actually takes politics seriously. It has gone out and said political identities are created and constructed through the hard work of politics. They can be made and remade. And the center and left in India is still trying to play that old game. That somehow there is a kind of social structure that will reassert itself. By the way, I think something like that is also true of the US in some ways, right? The left and center read too much social science. right? Social sciences, we are impulsively deterministic, right? There must be the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to happen. The right goes on and says, we go out and make those conditions. And that's part of that appeal, right? It is a kind of, and right now I think we see only one party playing that game. And I think that's the big difference from 1977.
It's time to make politics.
It's time to make politics.
People use that phrase make, like make money,
Yes.
make war, but they don't say make politics. We need to make some politics. Last word, last question.
Oh,
Corey,
I
do you have-
just, I don't want to, one thing you did say in a lecture you gave at the University of Chicago was that we mistake the restraints on freedom of speech as actually trying to restrain the speech, when indeed you think it's about power because it's diverting attention to the very speech that's being called out. And that in response, if we try to protect speech, we're going to end up arguing over the minutia of the rules and what is and isn't protected. So maybe your last word could be in a university setting. How do we balance those things?
Good question.
So I must confess, I've become a much more free speech absolutist. And one, I actually do think there is an interesting moment where part of the function of censorship these days is actually not to censor. It is to show that you have the power, and in some senses, most of these people know you'll actually draw more attention to the thing, right? And by the way, which also then makes it hard to create a political backlash, because most people's reaction is, yeah, but this is like crying fire in Noah's flood. I mean, there's so much information, you can get access to it anyway, right? So what are these shadow battles that are happening at these institutions, right? We are not going to let you screen this documentary. Of course, the government also knows every kid with a smartphone can see that documentary, right? Right? The point of it is to actually draw you into a battle over the consistency of your institutional principles. And as I said, there's an asymmetry here, because all you have to do to discredit liberals is to sow doubt about their integrity. The other side doesn't have to, doubt is not the issue here. So that's a battle we are never going to win, as it were. And so the easiest thing to do is actually to kind of take the free speech view. I mean, the university has norms in terms of, you have to answer questions, those kinds of the standard norms of civil discourse, back and forth argument. But I actually think it's a mistake. I think it's a liberal mistake liberals are making. Liberals in India historically made, right? If you think of what makes the curtailment of academic freedom in India possible now, when you have had the left and center that has given its support to blasphemy laws for so long, right? Don't offend communities, don't offend religious groups, right? What do you think is going to happen, right? It's a short step from them to saying, well, if university curricula offend us, why shouldn't the same offensive norms not apply? And my worry about the US is actually the process is going to happen in reverse, which is the universities are actually going to take categories of offense, expand their definition and ambit, and it is going to at some point start inflecting First Amendment jurisprudence, right? The second thing about the most pragmatic argument for free speech absolutism is, if you can send a strong institutional signal, we are the kind of society that even tolerates some pretty, unworthy people, right? That's probably a better way of making everyone feel safe. Look, if even those kinds of people are safe here, right? We can be assured that our liberties will be safe. Two, it does away from mobilization, the politics of mobilization, right? Because what is the politics of free speech now? It has become the object of competitive political mobilization. Will you regulate my group's speech or some other group's speech, right? Right? And the more you can keep the speech regime out of the politics of competitive mobilization. That's the history of free speech in India in some sense, right? It became an object of competitive mobilization between communities, right? If you're going to ban something offensive to community X, well, then let us also exercise our political power. So I think there are actually good and pragmatic reasons as well to err on the side of free speech expansiveness than to try and get into the minutiae of regulating. I mean, as an administrator, you will be tripped up in 5 minutes. Believe me, there are political groups who are so clever at trapping you that, the principal ground that we trust our citizens is actually, probably the safest ground.
Pratap, we could go on for 3 hours, but we have to stop. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.